before. He's been here before.
Yeah, he has. Actually, he did a reading for us.
Yes.
I've known Kenneth for 50 years. I mean, he's been alive that whole time. And his children and his wife, I mean, he's got a whole family,
You mean he's like a person and everything?
Yeah, he's like a regular person.
Yeah, but Donald, we see many people who have had visions that I'm not sure if I believe in.
Yeah.
I would say if you saw Kenneth in a Texas bar, he would kind of fit right in.
I would love that.
I mean,
I would do anything for that.
He's not a cowboy or anything like that, but he's
a guy.
He's a guy, yeah.
Good.
Well, he's got, I don't know, I suppose he's still got a ponytail and a beard and, he's a pretty big guy. He's kind of barrel-chested fellow.
Yeah.
You could see him making bookcases, which he has had to do almost his entire life.
The only chance he has. As he says, we all build labyrinths, but his labyrinths are physical and filled with books. Next time, when the pandemic is over and I can go down to visit him, it will be the first time I've seen his new house. And he's telling me that if I thought the old house was crowded with books, wait till I get a load of the new house.
Yeah, he was very fortunate on that. I think he bought one of the, I was a little envious at the time. He bought like a 4,000 square foot McMansion in Austin, during one of the housing busts. Right. He got it at a great price.
Lucky timing.
And he had actually, the first time I saw it, you could actually see the house. I haven't seen it recently enough, but he was already talking about how he was going to put like a steel beam in the garage to reinforce the second floor above it because he had calculated the loads and he thought the books would come right through the ceiling.
He's right about that.
Yeah. So I was like, oh, yeah. And when he's been to my house, it's like, what do you have all this empty space? Why is that? Like your walls aren't covered. And I
just think how many more bookshelves you could work in here with a sort of crinkled structure. You can navigate your way through.
Do you know what area of Austin he lives? I live in Austin, so
yeah, he lives kind of in the northeast.
Northeast, okay.
Northeast. It was probably in the nav system on one of my cars at one time. but yeah, you sort of go around north. There's a road like a beltway or something, kind of around Austin to the north. And you get off and he's not too far from that road, I don't think. I mean, it wasn't very crowded. I haven't been there in a while. And I don't, just because my relatives in Louisiana died, I don't go back nearly as often. I'm getting older. I don't drive as often. Driving across Texas is...
You drove to Louisiana?
Yeah, I used to do it at least once a year, for sure twice. For sure every other year, because I have relatives in, my family's from Louisiana.
What part of Louisiana?
Around Baton Rouge.
Yeah.
That's where I met Kenneth, at LSU, when he grumbles about the fascists that ran the campus, I didn't notice any fascist in the bars, but then there could have been some in the classrooms, but I wasn't looking.
Part of what's amazing is that even with the larger house, filling it back up again, the really scary thing is they still had to get off-site storage and move enormous numbers of boxes of books into off-site storage to make room for his burgeoning philosophy book collection. It's just huge.
Yeah, well, the house in Duncanville was just you needed stilts, sort of, because it wasn't just the bookshelves on the walls, it was the piles you had to step over. I mean, if he would have ever made it to Hoarders or something like that, although he could find everything.
He could find everything.
Yeah.
And there wasn't any trash there. It was all like rare editions and out of print books. And It's like Hoarders would have been tearing their hair out trying to figure out what to do, because well, he sells books. He needs this stuff. Good luck figuring out how to organize it.
And I would say maybe his largest subsection is not philosophy. A lot more are rare art books.
Yeah.
Or he's got books that on how to do art, how to draw, how to paint, how whatever. He's got collections of artists that he really likes. He's got comics and stuff like not Superman or anything maybe, but and he's got enormous science fiction collections. Got
when was he at UT teaching?
He wasn't. I don't think he taught at UT. He went to his undergraduate school there. I don't know if he ever taught. He taught in Dallas at Catholic University there. He taught in Baton Rouge at LSU.
Wait a minute, University of Dallas?
I don't know. Is it a Catholic school?
No.
Yeah, University of Dallas is.
Well, that's he taught classical philosophy.
Yeah.
And he went to school.
That's where Marshall McLuhan taught too. I think.
Well, I don't know anything about that. It's where
Sorry.
He went to Yale. He got his doctorate at Yale in New Haven. So that's where he talks about the guy he studied under at Yale, I think, Silberman.
Yeah.
You see that name, but I've not heard.
Oh,
Kenneth
how old is
ever
Kenneth
say-
Smith? How old is Kenneth Smith right now, Donald?
He's in his late 70s. He's a few years older than I am.
Because I don't know if you know Don Evans. He was very active in philosophy group here in Austin, and he and Leonard hosted a meeting, more than one meeting, many meetings. And Donald was not Donald. Don Evans is his name. He went to Yale. He was mid-70s. He passed away last year.
The
Suddenly.
guy doing the Girder group, yes.
Yeah, exactly. The Girdles group. And he went to Yale, and he was another person whose house was full of books. He had, floor to ceiling books, bookcases everywhere when he was in meetings. And I used to tease him about, I'm going to come to his library and check out some books someday, and anyway.
Well,
Go and watch the wonderful, I haven't seen the recent, but the 1966 version of Fahrenheit 451, where the fireman's rubbing his hands as he's found a house full of books. Some great scenes of that movie.
Yeah.
well, a lot of people think I have a lot of books, but I know I only have about 2,000, which I spent more money on the bookcases probably than books.
Okay, Donald, what are those books done for you?
Well, they've let me hold conversations with people like you, Stephen.
Yeah, but I don't have that many books.
Well,
I've been getting rid of them.
if you really, I think if you take one book and really read it well, that's all you need to do. You'll have discovered everything. I don't know. I don't know why I have. I've read a lot of the books. I have books I haven't read. But
So one of my arguments against the atheists is if the human being and all creatures that exist in the whole of creation is an accident, then it must have holes in it. The human mind, as good as it is, must be full of holes. Human reason would have to be full of holes. So I think our condition is hopeless if the atheists are right. And maybe we're wasting their time pursuing knowledge.
Well, following up on what David Roel is suggesting is maybe what we need to do, not during this session today, but between sessions,
Yes.
is think about what are the philosophic, either the philosophers or the philosophical questions we find most pressing, and put those together into a list of questions for Kenneth.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Do the questions have to pertain to the text?
No.
Okay.
As he says, you can start anywhere because all of philosophy is interconnected. So it almost doesn't matter where you start. You'll find, even if we all set out to ask him about philosophers and philosophical questions that we thought weren't related to the text, by the time he was done talking to us about it, we'd have found countless connections back to the text again.
That's pretty cool.
So, Nietzsche, Stephen, you probably have some favorite Nietzsche quotes and concerns, among other things.
Oh, I've only been looking at Nietzsche in the last year or two. I came across him. I was standing in the bookstore, opened the book and thought, yeah, I could understand his basic dilemma, which was the same as my basic dilemma. And that is, he felt trapped in a world where science was telling him there's nothing but three dimensions, Newtonian physics.
Mm-hmm.
And his scientific mind in the 19th century had to accept that. But inwardly, his instincts, if you like, his emotional instincts rebelled against the idea. So he was in a dilemma. If he had have survived to the time, say, quantum physics came along, that would have been his escape route out of the prison of Newtonian physics. But I never read him. A guy came along one day and he said, oh, actually, you think very similar to Nietzsche. And I said, no, I never bothered to read him. He said he was quite surprised. And I said, I understood his essential dilemma just by opening the prologue of one of his books. And I just never bothered. But yeah, looking at it since then, yeah.
Yeah, so this will be interesting. I mean, so all right, so that's what's coming. I'm really glad David told us. I'm excited. Last time I talked to Kenneth was a couple months ago, and I thought I heard rumblings of a readiness to do something, but it was still in abstract. So I'm glad David's pinned him down to let's actually do this. And
well, here's a question for Kenneth. Why do most of humanity portray happiness in their mental prison? Why do most of humanity seem content to live in a mental prison?
I'm jotting this down. I'm going to capture it from the text. So why do most of humanity seem content to what?
To live in a mental prison. Satisfied or content to live in such a place.
Right. Oh, he'll have a field day with that one.
Well, this was Nietzsche's basic dilemma.
Yes.
The 19th century was a huge prison house for the mind.
Yes.
Not that it didn't have its positives.
Yeah. So as we proceed today with chapter 3, Epochs and Regimes, anytime someone thinks of a question that they have, doesn't have to be related to the text, just type it into the chat, and I'll capture all that, and David and I can make sure that it gets to Kenneth. And so we'll be working on that in parallel. So I thought we would move on from the introduction, unless people have specific questions, comments, or concerns, and dive into the next 2 chapters, which together make up part 1, Fugitive Images. The first of these, chapter 3, is Epochs and Regimes. And then when we wrap this one up, we'll move on to chapter 4, Personal Notes on Cosmic Issues. This book basically has 4 introductions. He starts with his preface about Y2K and the conflict of cultures. He does the introduction, chapter 2, which I think is a great overview of the concept of the book as a whole. But then he doesn't really want to dive in yet. So he takes some time to come at the question of what is this book even about from completely different angles. Instead of trying to summarize the book, in this one, Epochs and Regimes, he tries to basically confront the difficulty that moderns have even understanding the topic of the book, let alone the contents. But the idea that there could be different epochs and that they could have different worldviews is not allowed in the modern worldview. We think that there's only one worldview that's true and all the others are just defective in some way. We think that people in the past were primitive, inferior versions of ourselves. And the only thing to learn from them is to learn what it's like to be inferior. We don't think it's possible to look back at ancient epochs and have them able to see and understand easily things that we can only see or understand with difficulty. For us, that's impossible. Modernism's definition of itself doesn't allow for the possibility. So the whole project of this book doesn't make sense in modern terms. And so in this chapter, he confronts it directly. And he tries to peel back part of the problem and understand why is it hard for us to understand what a book like this could do for us? Why is it hard to understand why a project like this could be important? So I thought I'd start with that and then see if people have questions. It's not that long of a chapter, but it sort of aims right at one of the issues. Sharon, you did the reading this weekend. Does anything jump out at you? You're on mute right now.
I was halfway through this chapter and I kind of stopped because I got a little discouraged. Because one of the things that I'm struggling to understand with Kenneth is that everyone seemed to have be painted with a broad brush.
Yes.
So in the final paragraph of Time, History, and Nature, he says, meaning and implication are to moderns what we make of them. That's the last paragraph a sentence in the last paragraph in Time, History, and Nature. And then he moves on and he builds on that in Epochs and Regimes. And I was thinking that when I look around at moderns today, I think there's such a spectrum because we have progressed, not only scientifically, but the way we think. And I think we're constantly experimenting with new social ideas. So to lump us all into ineptitude, and this is the perception I get, is frustrating.
Yes. Let me try.
So help me understand where he's coming from with this.
I agree. Let me try tackling that. Have you done any reading about Kurt Gödel? The 19th century mathematician. In the late 19th century, there was a popular project among philosophers and mathematicians to try to create a provably correct framework for mathematics from the ground up that would be complete, that could explain all of mathematics in one coherent system. And they thought they could do it. They thought they could rationalize it and prove that everything is interrelated and it all makes sense. And big names like Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead worked on this.
David Hilbert. David Hilbert.
Yeah, many famous names worked on this project, because in the 19th century, we really believed that there was nothing that reason couldn't solve. And we believed that moderns were the most dedicated to reason of any people who had ever existed. So ergo, there should be no reason why this project couldn't succeed. We were dreaming grandly. You know, the world wars hadn't happened yet, the Holocaust and the gulags, all the demoralizing things of the 20th century hadn't occurred yet. And so we were sort of at the peak of our, our hopefulness. And along comes Kurt Gödel, and I should put a link to him because he's such an important person to know about. Let me do that link right now. Kurt Gödel. There we go. He's famous for the Incompleteness Theorem. There's a book that I was first introduced to it in the same way that many people were, by a book by Douglas Hofstadter called Gödel Bach, which I will also put a link to. Here we go. There it is. Gödel Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid. This book by Douglas Hofstadter was a bestseller. It won awards. It was a huge formative influence for a lot of us who grew up at a certain age. It explored ideas like, how does logic work? How does mathematics work? But it used pictures and music and art. So like it's got all this beautiful artwork from Escher. It explores Bach's canons and cantatas and so forth and how they're structured. And it explored Gödel's theorem, his incompleteness theorem. It's how we learned that one of the most remarkable things is here at the exact time when everyone thinks that they can create this perfect system that could explain everything and be complete. Gödel comes along and says, not only is that not true, that we can pull that off, but that he can prove that any model that you ever try to make about anything, through the mere act of trying to write it down and make rules about it, it casts shadows over its subject matter. There's a clumsiness to the mortal understanding. He doesn't use these terms. He uses mathematical terms to explain this. But in a non-mathematical sense, there is a sort of clumsiness to the way that mortals try to understand a complex world, such that the mere act of modeling it ensures that some things that are true that the model should have included, it will instead exclude. And some things that are false that the model should have excluded, it will instead include. And he proved that that's true for all scientific models. It can't be avoided. It's in the very nature of modeling things. And this was an enormous blow to the optimism of this 19th century project that we were going to make a perfect system of mathematics that could explain things. And what's interesting about this project is that previous epochs never believed they would understand everything. It wasn't part of the core design of earlier epochs that they were so sure of themselves that they knew before they ever started that if they just applied themselves and committed themselves and improved iteratively over time, that they would ever win, that they'd ever be victorious and have a complete explanation of the universe. They always thought there would be this bonus of mystery that human beings wouldn't be able to crack, because they were keenly aware of the limitations of the human mind and the finite lifespan of human beings and our inability to communicate clearly and all those things. But moderns sort of have pushed away that fundamental hubris, that fundamental humility, and embraced this hubristic idea that there aren't any limits for us. If we just keep exploring, if we just keep using our methodologies, we may not eventually know everything, But it'll be like in mathematics when you study calculus, when it says, you know, it goes toward infinity. It would just keep growing forever, and we'll just get better and better, what you see with Star Trek and so on. For a modern, the thing that's hard for a modern is that we don't know that certainty that we can always learn more and always be better is distinctive to us. We think that we are just like normal. We think we might be, you know, better off further down the road, but we think, you know, that there aren't fundamentally different worldviews in the past that can see things that we can't see. And so the idea that that the nature of our epoch could put limitations on us because we conceive of the world in a shared way is hard for us to take. It sounds like criticism. It sounds like it's saying we're bad. And we're, you know, that's not what we get in school, and that's not what we get through the news media and so forth. We get this, we're just the best, we're so good. That we don't know what it's like for the first time to take a bitter sip of that coffee without the sugar. Now, the thing about it is the nature of an epoch's worldview is such that the constraints that it applies, the kind of Gödelesque limitations, the fingerprints of the frame that limit what we can and can't understand, are not visible to us. The way that we imagine the world, it seems like we can see everything. It seems like we can express everything. It seems like we can understand everything. And so the idea that we can't, if someone says that we can't, it feels like it's an attack of some kind. It's a condemnation, is what I mean to say. But that's not how Kenneth means it when he writes these things. What he means to say is it's like when Julius Caesar thinks he's a god, and he has to hire someone to whisper in his ear over and over that he's mortal, because all around him everybody keeps telling him he's a god. And if he doesn't have someone reminding him, he might start to believe it. It's sort of the trap that moderns are in. Even moderns who are in disciplines where they know better, right? Like if you work in medicine, you're keenly aware of your limitations because you've got the life and death consequences of your actions all the time in front of you. And you've got all the metrics that you're using to measure your progress or lack of progress. And it's true that when you're working in a discipline like that, your expression of modernism is very different from the expression of modernism of a politician, right? Who can say whatever he wants and roar up the crowds and never gets measured. You're right that there's diversity. But what Kenneth is saying is the diversity is inside of a frame that we can't see. And what he's trying to do is bring that frame into view, not to condemn us or say that we're all clones or Xerox copies of each other, but to help us to understand what it is that we have in common that we can't see, that's invisible to us.
Okay.
So go ahead, Sharon. You got your
Can
hand
I
up.
just say one more thing? So I'm also reading this book called Rationality, and I wanted to bring this up because of what you just said. So the book is written by Steven Pinker, who is a psychology professor at Harvard. And the first half of the book, he tries to explain the scientific basis of rationality, how we make sense of making sense. So he does logic and forecasting and probability and math problems. And then he gets into the social side. And I'm almost done the book now. And what he is finding is that all those scientific metrics do not really add up to rationality. It still comes down primarily on the side of value and culture and the way the individual human being sees things. And I found that fascinating. It kind of dovetails with what you just said.
Yes.
So I have to delve a little more into Kenneth. I don't know, we seem to be contained in a bubble, but in that bubble, there are lots and lots of other little bubbles.
Yes.
And when I look at aside from the discipline that I spent my life in, and you have the life and death and the metrics. So it's, you think about it, but you know if you're going in one direction or the other. But I think when I look at society, some of the advances we've made in science, transplanting of hearts and lungs and kidneys, it's been huge.
Yeah.
The differences we've made in technology, Alexa, turn off the light, right? All those are, and so therefore and in that framework, we're constantly evaluating the way we live and our values and whatever we deem our morals to be. And I think it's been that way since the ancient times. It probably was just not as documented as it is now.
Yeah, when you look at the Antikythera device, you've read about that, right? From ancient Greece.
Yes.
And you see, you know, it's like you say, they were innovating spectacularly at a technological level. We just didn't record it. The medieval people were not interested in that stuff, so we lost it. But you know, that craftsmanship, the development, the iterative development of the craft over the time, the increasing science that allows us to ask new questions and learn new things, it's always been with us. But one of the things that's different about moderns is part of defining the frame. One of the things that's different about moderns is that in past epochs, there were, aside from epistemological questions of what's true and what's false, you know, what's measurable, past epochs felt like they had to agree on values. They felt it was essential, right? Socrates was put to death for not honoring the Olympian gods, because the Greeks thought, if we can't agree on that, we'll dissolve into civil war. We have to have that. We can explore all kinds of ideas, but there has to be a shared foundation of values, because without that, society would collapse. And they believed that, you know, fervently. The Romans would let you worship any gods you wanted, as long as you also worshipped the core pantheon, including the emperor. You know, it's like they didn't impose religious, you know, what do I want to say, monoculture on the world. Even while they were conquering the world, they allowed for this wide diversity, but they had to have a shared core. And they thought without that shared core, they would bring their entire war machine and trash the place until you would submit and agree on the shared core, like the Palestinian war, you know, the Jewish wars of the first century. So to them, agreeing on the need for a shared foundation of values was life and death. But the whole premise of the modern epoch is that we can put those questions aside and focus instead on the measurable things. You know, what we have to agree on is E equals MC squared. We have to agree on, you know, Boyle's law. We have to agree on all these fundamentals that allow us to build our technological civilization, but we don't feel like we have to agree about the nature of God, which is why we allowed Christianity to diverge into different approaches to understanding Jesus's message. And it's why we allow Buddhism and Islam, even if we do it imperfectly. That's why we allow there to be diversity, because core to modernism is the belief that we don't have to agree about those things, and yet still we'll be able to make a coherent civilization. You know,
so that's the challenge. Go ahead. Yes. Yeah. So that's the challenge, because one of the impression that I got is that shared core is no longer a shared core. And exactly. Is that our freedom? Is that what we call freedom? Because if you go all the way back to the Middle Ages, when they were painting stained glass windows in the churches, because the literacy rate was so low,
right?
The diversity of knowledge and opinion was just at the very top.
Yes.
The proletariats, as Marx called them, they did as they were told. And they were serfs and they worked in the fields, etc. But as we became modern, that shared core disappeared because we had more opportunities, more advantages,
right?
But the ability to think for ourselves,
right?
And that's what we're struggling with. I guess that's what you're saying. So that's what I saw. We're now instead of being just concentrated like this, we're wide open.
Right. So part of what has happened as a result is it encourages us to focus our efforts on the measurable mechanical things and to not focus much on the things that we don't agree about, like the nature of God, the nature of good and evil, what human life is for, and so on. When he criticizes moderns, what he's criticizing them for is not that they're bad at all things, but that they're bad at this specific thing that they've agreed to be bad at. Or more importantly, that they've agreed to be free about, by which we mean we never actually get together and talk about coming up with any core agreements. One of the ways that this manifests itself is we don't even agree whether human life is worth anything. And that certainly opens the doors to genocide and slavery and warfare on a scale we've never seen before. Because after all, if someone is pragmatic, which is supposed to be a modern virtue, then they're focused on accomplishing their goals at all costs. It's like, my goal is the thing that matters. That's what pragmatism is about, and everything else is sacrificable, including whether you have a right to live. So there is this weird instability in modernism, where at the same time that we're doing these amazing miracles, people are walking in space, we're firing satellites, and yet we can't get clean water to Flint, Michigan, right? How is it that we're so all powerful in these mechanical realms and yet so incompetent in the political and values realms? This is the thing that Kenneth's going after. And
I think I think he says it very well here in the last paragraph. He says, meaning and implications are to moderns what we make them. Moderns inhabit an envelope of infinitely reverberating artificialities, which is what you're talking about.
Yes.
Games, languages, rules, and roles that are of interest solely because we have willingly accredited their claim on our interests. That I thought was very well said.
That's right. This is what he's trying to talk about, is that since we sort of agreed to disagree about the most fundamental questions of life, it means that the way that people go about making up their own mind is sort of random. It might be what pleases them. It might be what family did they happen to grow up in and what did they learn as a kid. It might be, do they have a favorite news anchor who they find really persuasive and they just believe whatever he says. There's an incoherency, and the incoherency isn't about details of the civilization. It's about the core question of the civilization. Why do we even exist? How do we agree to treat one another? These are the things that we can't seem to bring into any kind of clear focus. And it's bizarre when you actually, you could say example after example after example of situations like Flint, Michigan, where it's a simple value proposition, and yet we're stumped by it and paralyzed and unable to act. And then in some other aspect of life, we're incredibly potent and able to transform things left and right. And it's like, how do we explain? It's like the cartoon figure of the bodybuilder on the beach with the gigantic upper torso and huge arms and tiny spindly little legs. And you're like, how can this be a person? Why are they so imbalanced? This is what he's going after. And you'll see, the sense of homogeneity where he breaks through that caricature is when he talks about the fact that where modernism gets its values is as random survivals from past epochs. So like Christianity is a survival from earlier epochs. Even though it's growing and transforming in the modern era, modernism per se doesn't endorse Christianity. It doesn't endorse any value system. It agrees to be neutral about these questions. And so, side by side, you can find some moderns who are very clueless about this stuff and other moderns who are deeply committed to it and think about it all the time. And that kind of lack of consistency, right, allows for the diversity that you're seeing. Kenneth would say that diversity, is core to modernism, because modernism agrees to disagree and it allows for an enormous variety of expression. But it's when we try to come together and make a whole that we sort of fall apart. because we don't have any basis to resolve these questions. It's not nature, right? Because the medieval world overthrew the ancients. And it's not God, because the modern world overthrew the medieval world. So how are we supposed to resolve value differences? And fundamentally, at the very foundation of modernism, the answer is we don't know. And that's why we keep fighting over this stuff. We just don't know how to answer these things. Stephen, then Joseph, then Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to bring up Lessing's Education of the Human Race. I put a link
Please.
there. I think it's a valuable little work to read. It seems to have been core documents in the idea that humanity was historically progressing. You don't really seem to find it that much. The people prior had a more cyclic view of history. And then at the end of the day, you just live on Earth and then you go to God. But Lessing was the one that seemed to have tapped into that idea, and Hegel, probably he was the major influence upon Hegel and that idea of historical progress. But yeah, the question of truth is something that keeps on coming up, and that is philosophy came to the conclusion that we don't know an absolute truth in any area bar mathematics. That was, say, the thought from a couple of centuries ago. And most people are very naive. They absolutely believe that, that we have a set of truths that can't be questioned in various fields. And philosophy said, no, the one area which there possibly are a set of universal truths we understand was mathematics. But of course, as I always point out, Godel came along and threw a bucket of water over that one. So now we're all at sea. People don't understand this. They think that there are absolute certainties. And philosophers worked out there weren't. And this is a trouble. Most people, even a lot of people that call themselves philosophers, are naive thinkers. They haven't gone on to the problems of doubt and uncertainty, which will eventually arise in philosophy. As David Rohl keeps on saying, if you want to be happy, keep away from philosophy.
Yes.
If you want to be happy, study philosophy. That's what I think.
Friedrich Schiller's on the aesthetic education of man. Is that what you're thinking of, Stephen?
Lessing's Education of the Human Race was a small work.
Yes.
Which came out in the late in the 1770s, I think, 1778 or something like that. So Schilling, you're pointing out Schilling had a similar.
Yeah, I think they're writing in a similar vein. Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Stephen. That's right.
Oh, Schiller, sorry.
Joseph and Phil. Go ahead, Joseph.
I mean, there's been a lot of interesting comments, and just this idea of truth in general is something that I've been kind of struggling with, personally. Somebody just tells me everything's true. A lot of people tell me, that or nothing is true. And I keep going back and forth because I started thinking about that in terms of design. But really quickly, I just have a question regarding, you brought up, Girdles and Completeness Theorem. And it was interesting how a lot of mathematicians refuse to accept actually Girdles theorem because it would actually disprove their work. And actually you kind of still see that today with people and with dogma and the way they kind of revert back to their thinking, that you can actually show them that something different than what they actually believe, and that they will not necessarily, they won't accept it. So it happens in the field of mathematics as much as it does it happens as much in the field of mathematics as it does in philosophy. But this ability even to deal with the unknown as well is also an interesting thing, because people are then, once you upend their view of the world, they have no idea, like now they're dealing with the unknown and what that does to their people's psyche as well, is something, interesting in itself. But wasn't there a group of people that are still, I mean, obviously, that are now like dedicating their lives to proving unprovable statements? Like essentially, is that, and if that's a thing, what is it? Do you know? And I know that may not be a fair question, because it may be a little off topic, but I was just curious about that. If you had an answer, if anybody had an answer, you would have it.
I don't know if there's a movement. I see people doing it, and it's interesting. And when I was younger, I was a contrarian.
Mhm.
So anytime somebody told me something was unprovable, I was immediately drawn to it. I was like, well, let's find out. Maybe I can make it. Maybe I can prove it. I could be the one. The whole trisecting an angle with just a straight edge and a compass. I worked on that for a while, and it was about 10 years later, somebody else actually cracked it, and everyone thought it was unprovable. That it could. They thought it was proven that it couldn't be done until the guy did it. So yeah, it's a whole area, but I think, one of the things that's curious about the modern epoch is that it has so many things side by side in it at the same time that don't reconcile with each other. So to cite an example that's close to Sharon's hearts, let's talk about science for a moment. And specifically, let's separate the corrupted forms of science from the purer science. When you're actually doing the philosophy of science, when you're actually embracing human ignorance, and you're measuring the real world to get feedback on whether our ideas make sense or not. The actual core of the scientific philosophy. Enormous numbers of moderns grow up never having conducted a single scientific experiment in their lives. We just don't teach it. Like, we moderns want to be called the scientific epoch. We want credit for science, but we really only teach it to a small number. Or if we teach it as the dogmatic results of scientific experimentation instead of teaching how to conduct experiments and how to question your own beliefs. I mean, millions and millions and millions of moderns can't question their beliefs. They're just sure of themselves, and they've never had the experience of starting out sure, measuring reality and discovering you're wrong, and then learning how to give up the idea that has been disproven. So when we're trying to characterize the modern epoch, can we call it a scientific epoch if most people never conduct any science? Or is it that we have enslaved, in some sense, scientists economically through debt and through paychecks, so that a small number of them can give us the goods of scientific discovery without contaminating the power structures of our politics and economics, right? To what extent are we actually trying to frame off science and keep it from fulfilling its promise by preventing it from asking questions we don't want it to ask, like, do we really have the best of all possible governments? Is this really a fair way to do the economy? Is this, what would happen if we started embracing empirical investigation of all these other questions? If we were really the scientific epoch, we would want to do that. But instead, we do everything in our power to prevent it, which sort of suggests that we exist, like the medievals, we exist in this curious state in which we are and are not scientific at the same time. We strongly feel we are scientific, and amazing progress is made in scientific investigation during this epoch, at the exact same time that whole areas of problems in our society are kept absolutely protected from science to make sure science never touches them. It's weird, right? It's contradictory. So when you're trying to sum up the modern epoch, it's a problem, because almost anything you could say on even just this one question, are we or are we not scientific, almost everything we could say is both true and false at the same time.
Right.
We could say that we're not, except we're having all this great progress. We could say we are, except most people never do. You know what I mean? You see the contradiction I'm talking about?
Yeah. Can I make a quick comment?
Yeah, please.
I mean, it's kind of, this is, again, this really parallels some of the other things that you talked about when it's relationship to religion. Like, how
Yes.
religion, how people, you can't challenge. They're the same thing. The moderns have become exactly what they loathe in the sense, in the sense that they've actually believe everything, is can be explained through the scientific method. And so therefore, this is the way we're actually going to move forward. And this it's an incredible contradiction not to see in oneself. I would think.
Right.
I'm full of contradictions, so I shouldn't be criticizing anybody. But
yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. So I think this is one of the things that Kenneth goes after, is that there is this characteristic incoherence in modernism that moderns themselves can't see, because the level at which the incoherency happens is the level at which we mostly have learned not to ask questions. When we look out at, how do we make roads, and how do we do voting systems, and how do we build missiles, there's a large degree of agreement and consistency. But when we look at things like, how should we dispose of fracking waste, or how do we prepare young children to be adults who are capable of managing their anger, or things like this, we find this weird incoherency. We don't agree on anything. It's remarkable that the Greeks so uniformly agreed that Homer was the textbook of the Greeks. In the 500s and 400s and 300s, every Greek child was reading the Iliad and the Odyssey. They all read it. They were all raised on it. And they had that in common. Whether they agreed about, who was good and who was bad, they at least had a common frame of reference to argue about and talk about and to refer things to. But we really increasingly don't have a common frame of reference. There was a, go ahead, Sharon.
That's in the 6th paragraph of the text, where Kenneth talks about just that.
Yeah, cite a sentence.
It says, ancient culture attuned the Greeks to see an inherently organic nature, to search out intrinsic order, implicit in nature itself. Modern culture conditions moderns to see a stochastic universe, which is a dominion of accidentalism and meaninglessness.
Yes. Yes.
Said our era is far less interested in pure science, which is exactly what you were saying, the discovery of the system of nature, than in technology, the imposition of artificial order upon nature.
Yes. Yeah, this is something Stephen talks about a lot, is that moderns confuse science and technology because we believe the tools to control nature make us scientists, even though it's very easy to apply technology without having a single scientific bone in your body. We've made it easy, as Gilbert Murray says, for people who don't actually have any commitment to empiricism to nevertheless reap the benefits of empiricism and use it for even the most brutal, clumsy-headed things to do. We've put this at their disposal. And so it goes back to that question that gets raised over and over in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries now, which is, okay, it's nice to know how to build an atomic bomb. It's great that our educational system prepares us to do that, but shouldn't our educational system prepare us for whether we ought to use an atomic bomb, at least as well as it prepares us to use one? We need the ethical education and the epistemological education to be able to wield this power responsibly. But that's exactly where the vacant area is in modernism. Phil, and then Donald, and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I think that might have something to do with the fact that there really is a dividing line between the mind and experience and sort of logic itself.
Yeah.
I know art fairly well, and I think art is actually asking this question. I'll start with Escher, which I like, but he doesn't hold high in my, you know,
Yeah.
pantheon of artists. But he is very interesting, and the drawing that I like is the hand that draws the hand, which speaks
I
to the
love
same
that
problem.
drawing.
I mean, it really is the one that illustrates the problem, while it remains in the frame, unfortunately. But
Yes.
nonetheless, it shows that there's a weakness in the frame. And so I start out with that, and then I would say, one of the important artists, Southern California artist, is Robert Irwin.
Yes.
And Robert Irwin is quite often called a conceptual artist, and he hates that. He says, I'm not a conceptual artist, I'm a perceptual artist, which is quite different, right? And he dealt with the question, in a sense, how that relationship between, I think, the experiential world and the objective world, in a way, okay?
Yes.
He began by asking the question that Bishop Berkeley asked, if the tree fell in the forest, is there a sound if there's no one there to hear it? Okay. And he turned that question upside down, I think, which is a very, very interesting thing. He says, is there mankind if trees never fell? Because he's saying that, in a sense, we evolve out of a kind of parallelism, maybe not exactness, but a kind of parallelism in relationship to the environment we live in. That's why we are there. If the environment had been like Mars, or Titan, we would be different, okay? So he actually sees that there actually is a relationship. It's a mysterious relationship, but nonetheless is connected. And I think that's something that, for instance, the metaphysical painter de Kergel deals with, and he sees that there's kind of this, he doesn't see it directly, but he sees a kind of a paradox between the world we live in and this ominous feeling that there's something kind of wrong. And he shows it by these strange juxtaposition of shadows being cast in the landscape, that by the way, are very, very, how should I say, fascist architecture in a funny way. So that's strange. And then I'm going to lead to surrealism. Surrealism is really dealing with this strangeness of how do you come to understand a world that is sort of out of alignment. And that's broken into two parts. What you call the academic surrealists, who are actually rendering the representation they're doing. And then the other part, which is what you call automatic surrealists, who are just sort of inspired by making gestures. And these gestures somehow shows the way because it's not constrained by a system, a structure that's already here that's illustrating the thing.
Yeah.
And which led to essentially abstract expressionism, which, by the way, ties all the way back to Romanticism about the human spirit expressing itself, like with Pollock, that the canvas is the arena of action, of doing in the world.
Yes.
And so therefore, what it really did was united sort of like the Cubist deconstruction of space and fragmenting of space so that it finds multiple dimensions, and how it's then united with automatic surrealism of expression. Okay. Then I'm going to move to somebody called Jan Dippids, which is very interesting. He's a conceptual artist. He did this very, very interesting piece called Perspective Correction. What he did was he, on a big lawn with a building in the back, he dug a hole, not a hole, but a patch in the grass that was reverse trapezoidal to the background. And then he photographed it. And when you photographed it, you know, your mind knows that there's something wrong with that, but you can't help but see the square in
Yes.
the picture, which should be trapezoidal, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
so it's kind of like, then there's this paradox that talks about, in a sense, your vision is telling you one thing. This is just a flat square. And that, you know, your mind knows that somehow it's trapezoidal. It's expanding in space as you go back, but you
Yes.
can't help it. So there's this flux that's going on that's cluing you. And I think this actually, I was going to say, how to say, that actually leads to Kant in a funny way, right? I mean, Kant had the problem, and I didn't understand this until just recently when somebody explained it, with the problem of how's it, what do you call it? The synthetic a priori, right?
Yeah.
And he was answering what's his name? The
Hume.
not Hume, no. He was answering the Scottish philosopher. Well, what's his name? I forgot.
Hobbes?
Not Hobbes, but the guy Hume, David Hume.
David Hume.
Yeah.
David Hume. Sorry. I don't know why
Okay,
I said
David
Hobbes.
Hume says, you know, like the problem with science and actually reason is that it never really explains causality. I mean, things happen and so forth, and you just make a connection, and the connection is not really external, is really internal, right? Because you weave it together and create a relationship that presumes the causal, but actually that's just a story, right? Of course, that upset Kant, because like that means that not only discredit somebody like Plato, but also discredit science, right? That we're living in this world that we presume is connected in some way in a causal relationship, and how he was trying to save both, I guess, the idealism of Plato and the experimentalism of science by allowing for this sort of synthetic a priori, because all a priori statements are logically posited, right?
Right.
They're circular in some sense, self-referential.
Right.
And he says, and he made the distinction that this is the part that I did not understand before, the difference between the transcendent and the transcendental. The transcendent is something beyond, like God, right? It's outside of our understanding. It comes inward. But the transcendental is something that we have not experienced, but we assume that somehow it is valid, conditionally valid. You know, like, okay, I'll take your argument, but we need to prove it.
Right.
Right? We need to prove it because it's conditional. Okay. Otherwise, you just reject everything. I never experienced it, no, whatever. Okay. Then you have the problem with Hume. It's conditional. And what you do is, okay, I'll accept your argument until whatever. Now prove it. Right? And science is there to prove it with a data point. And I think that distinction is very important, which, by the way, leads to Kenneth Smith and Jan Dippids. Yes, it looks like a square. I swear it's a square. I experience a square, and that I know somehow I know it isn't. The way you prove it is to move somewhere else. You change your perspective.
You have to change your perspective.
Exactly. That is Kenneth Smith. Okay, because that's exactly what Einstein did. Is that you change the perspective, and now, now I'm beginning to get it. I'm beginning to get why the thing looked like a square.
Yes.
When I knew it wasn't a square, somehow I sensed it wasn't a square, but it looked like a square in my experience. But
Yes.
the changing the perspective by moving somewhere else, you say, well, wait a minute, this is getting distorted. And then you finally get to long sideways. Oh, okay, this was a trapezoid after all.
That's
and
right.
so I think that's what Kenneth Smith is saying, is that having these other perspectives allows you to move away from the frame of reference of Jan Dippids, who sort of set up for you to misunderstand reality, that the trapezoid, in fact, is a square.
Yeah.
And you would swear with a stack of Bible. What did you see? Oh, I saw a square.
So Phil, can you put in the comments the names of those two artists that you mentioned in this discussion, so we can follow up afterwards?
You mean Robert Irwin?
Yes.
No, I don't know how to use the chat thing. That's why the reason. Robert
Okay.
Irwin, Southern California artist. Okay. Bunch of surrealist artists, but like Jackson Pollock, abstract expressionist.
Robert Irwin, and then the other one that you mentioned was
Jan Dippids, JON DIBBITS, a Dutch artist. He's a
Dippids
conceptual
or Dippids.
Dippids.
Okay.
And I think that the artist was dealing with that. So he's dealing with these sort of like, how do you change perspective of metaphysical question that is circular? Because you have to somehow justify your concept of nature with an experience. And I think that's what that linkage between Kant and Jan Dippids it's about.
I'll follow up and look at their work. Thank you. Donald and then Stephen. Go ahead, Donald.
Yeah, I want to talk to Joseph. Just the rest of you can go get a potty break or something.
I'm ready.
No, you're ready. No. As a young student, I studied math and philosophy. And of course, after being exposed to Girdle, I took his challenge to all of my math professors. They all knew his result. They knew it better than they taught it in the philosophy department, because it got all, I don't know, became metaphor in the philosophy department. But as probably the best professor I had said, of course we know about this. But Girdle's results, you have to choose when you're making a system between it being inconsistent or incomplete. You can have a complete system. It will just have unprovable theorems. And he said, this one professor said, I got my PhD by proving one of these things. Everybody said this was a Gödel truth. I said, here's the proof. Go look elsewhere. There's no test that can be applied to a mathematical statement using Gödel's work that says this is one of my truths.
Right.
He constructed a statement that says something like this statement is not provable, but it has a proof. So it created a contradiction or a paradox. So that was fine. The other is that most of these mathematicians really didn't like to be called scientists. They weren't scientists. They did study abstraction and pattern, but they didn't study the world. And so they were perfectly content at the time. It seems to be rarer now. Mathematics was over in the College of Arts and Sciences with the other, where you had these pure things from the classic 7 subjects that ended up in a liberal education. And mathematics was one of them. And it was very useful. I think part of what's happened science, mathematics never talked much about meaning, but modern science, as opposed to maybe ancient science, classical science, has been really well, I don't have to coin a word here, bonosified or something.
Sure.
It's become strictly instrumental. It has nothing to do with setting ends. You know, it tells you how to manipulate things or whatnot. That science is a lot closer to technology than it used to be. And I guess I'll go to Sharon somewhat next. In that, one of the things that seemed to me that Plato and Aristotle, when they use medicine, which is a Greek science, as an example, one of the things they're most fond of is that it's normative, is that it sets standards. They have a concept of health by which they can judge you and say whether you're healthy or not. And it doesn't include like fat but fit, or I want to be a girl, or anything like that. You know, here's what you have to do. This is, you want to be a healthy human being? This is what you need to be. You don't get to make this up for yourself. And that's sort of the thing that modern sciences have been stripped of their values or their ability to understand a subject area to the point where they can point to the inherent values that it might have at some area. I struck a nerve somehow.
Yes, you did.
Okay. Well,
You succeeded. You succeeded if that's what you're after.
No, I'm not trying to be antagonistic. I'm trying. I mean, I'm saying that the ancient view of medicine was different from the modern view of medicine.
Correct.
It wasn't, gosh, I wish my nose was smaller. It was, you know, the doctor told you what it meant to be healthy. You didn't tell the doctor what you wanted your health to be like. So I think that's different. And I'm not sure that's true of every doctor or generally. I know medicine has had a long history. I think of, Hippocrates and the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. And then I've read like Lewis Thomas's books. They were sort of from the 1960s or 70s. He was a professor, I think, at Harvard Medical School who had he was a doctor. And he had worked as a young man helping his father, who was a doctor. And his father told him, you know, it was like 1920 before medicine stopped doing harm. That so-called modern medicine still was doing crazy things to people. You know, it trying to poison them to get them well. And it took us a long time, medicine, Lewis Thomas writes, to just start watching, to get back to observing the progression of a disease.
Right.
So that we can at least tell the person what their prospects are, what the prognosis is. We can make a diagnosis to get to a prognosis. Boy, these Greek words are great. I love them.
They are.
I love the 2 years I spent studying Greek were wonderful. But anyway, and then medicine actually started coming up with ways to get some scientific understanding. But I just find that, you know, if you go from 400 BC to 1900 years, that's 2,300 years for a field that wants to first do no harm to begin to stop doing harm. Not that it wasn't all along, it's just that it was a long, slow process to understand the field to get there. So, you know, I'm glad they did. You know. Well, I think that's enough.
Thanks, Donald. Yeah, there's a book, right? Did you cite the book? There's a book about the history of medicine that includes talking about how recently they finally started doing seriously empirically driven medicine.
I don't know. Lewis Thomas, I think, wrote a column for the New England Journal of Medicine, and they got sort of like Stephen Jay Gould, and they got put into books on medicine, and he wrote a bit about the modern history, you know, about we don't give people arsenic and mercury. we know these are not medicinal compounds anymore.
Right.
But can I just say something, Donald?
Oh, please.
First, do no harm was a good premise then, and it still is now, because you have to take everything in context and the evolution of the science at the time. Pre-antibiotics, pre-anesthesia, pre-surgery, pre the identification of germs.
Right.
We still practice medicine, and the intent on the administration of whatever you got was to do no harm. However, science has allowed us to evolve over a period of time. And today, you will have a patient who's got, say, advanced cancer, and you can do no more. You stop giving the chemotherapy because you're about to do harm. Every single medication that you take today has the potential to do harm. It's just minimized. And it's a matter of doing risk. So that's still the concept. But science has allowed us to accommodate to the body, to preserve it more than we did then, because we've got so many discoveries. So it's still a concept.
I was not arguing against the concept or if it was a bad concept. I was just trying to point out historically that it has been a long time coming from a goal set by Hippocrates. I don't know that. Yeah.
From the Greeks. That's why we're modern.
Yeah.
No.
You know, for me, part of understanding medicine under modernism is about understanding the tug of war it's caught in. There is, on the one hand, the ideal of the science and the making sure that it serves, you know, human values. But on the other hand, you've got the Tuskegee experiments, you've got indigenous women being sterilized in hospitals right up through the 1970s. You've got, and you know, these are medical personnel, and countless examples like this could be cited, where what's happening is that people trained in the technology of medicine, but not adequately trained in the ethics of medicine, would use their power for nefarious purposes that they didn't recognize as nefarious because they hadn't had even the most basic education and moral competence in how to tell right from wrong. And what we see in modern medicine today, with the way that that medicine is getting smarter about end-of-life care and thinking about, you really shouldn't do everything you can. You should only do what helps. And when it stops helping, you should stop do it.
Correct.
In my lifetime, this has been a new development. Mm-hmm. You know, it was an ideal in the past, but it was an ideal in the past largely trampled. And one of the reasons it was trampled is in the mid 20th century, you know, there was still a lot of money to be made by throwing every technique you had at a dying body and, racking up the bill. And it took a while for there to be a pushback and say, you know what, this is unethical and we have to stop doing this.
The wallet biopsy.
The wallet biopsy. Yes. I forgot that term. Thank you, Sharon. That's the one. The wallet biopsy. So, this is the thing that's hard for moderns, is that if we were to try to say in a simple term over the course of the last 200 years, what is medicine's value system, we couldn't do it because it's changed. And even to this day, some medical practitioners are sharper about ethics than others are. It's just, there's still a tug of war for the soul of medicine.
One last thing, Donald, there's a documentary on Netflix called The God Committee, which I thought was very well done. And it really explores some of the fundamental ethical issues in medicine. Who should live and who should die? And it's based on politics, values, and money. And those are usually the three big determinants. And it's a very good documentary, The God Committee.
I've seen it. I've not watched it. I will now, though, for sure.
Yes. Yeah, because it raises some very interesting questions and gives you a bird's eye view that when we sit in those transplant committees, those ethics committees, we're trying to answer unanswerable questions.
Well, the fact that medicine tries to answer questions like this, I think is very much to your credit, because I doubt if very many, physicists or chemists or any of, there are lots of scientific fields that have gotten beyond, have become even more modern, in that they've given up even pretending to think about the ethical consequences of their work. So I'm all for medicine hanging on here, thinking about these questions.
To answer Joseph's question, the God Committee, and that's it's not really called that in the hospital,
I thought that was.
No, it's called the God Committee is the Hollywood name. It's really called the Transplant Service or the Transplant Committee.
Right.
Yeah, to be serious, and it's multidisciplinary. You have a priest, a lawyer, a surgeon, an anesthesiologist, an internist, a pediatrician, and the clergy. Multiple levels of clergy, Judaism, Catholicism, so that once the ethical issues, and that is also the composition of ethics committees. So once the medical issues are distilled, then the value system is applied to it. And that discussion is usually a very rich one. The God Committee is just the Hollywood name.
And it's on Netflix?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to watching that. Thank you, Sharon.
Me too. Thank you.
Stephen, then Sharon, then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask people to be careful with history when you keep on thinking in terms of equality and good for all. One of the things I've learned exploring historical societies is again and again they were hierarchical. You might say that there was the only people that mattered were people who owned land or had an important business. The rest, the common workmen, the servants on the land, the labourers, they were just livestock as far as these societies were concerned. The Romans called them the children. Well, this is the thing. For example, when you bring up the issue of the blackamoors in England,
Yeah.
that wouldn't have mattered to them so much. They didn't really care what race the servants were,
Right.
because you were all inferior.
Right.
Only the people that own stuff, only the people that were at the top of society. It was quite fairly broad, but you're looking at a few percent in the population that mattered. And for example, you're having Tudor England, you couldn't just wander around as a common person. You had to have papers. You had to have papers which were signed by a priest. Oh, I'm going to visit my relative. in this town 50 miles away. If you
Yeah.
got picked up, you were picked up under vagrancy, and either you return to where you belong or you're pressed into service. They had indentured servitude. If you hopped off a ship somewhere and started wandering around, they'd pick you up and try to find you a master.
Yeah.
And you had to spend at least 7 years in indentured servitude as a foreigner before you were given a free chance to find a new master. And for this question of the blackamoors, it would have been the question of there's a lot of vagrants. A lot of people would hop ship. England was a relatively free place compared to Spain. They didn't treat you very nice in Spain if you're a servant. In England, they had sort of a democracy. No, get in your head, it's like ancient Athens. Only 40,000 of a population of, say, 500,000 mattered. The rest didn't. They're expendable. Get over this idea of equality when you're looking at historical societies, and you might have to get over the idea of equality even in this one. It's probably a rare moment in history where this weird idea that, everybody's going to be treated equally will actually exist. When Columbus went to America, his attitude to the people he came across is, here's people who will be my servants. I am the master.
That's what he said.
And more than that, I'm benefiting them by making them my servants. I'm raising them up. And if a few die in the process, well,
Totally worth it.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And beware being the individual in the modern era, that beware being down low on the rung, because you're like a dog which is pushing its empty dog bowl at the masters and expecting it to be filled up. I don't know. In the future, I see with too many people on the planet, we'll probably go back to a condition where most of the population will be virtual drones, slaves, servants. It's a very rare moment in history when there's such an advance in technology that there was more being supplied than could be consumed. But once the population reaches a certain level, I don't think this will be the fate of the common man anymore.
On the question of hierarchies, you'll be pleased to hear that one of the chapters upcoming under Ancient Civilization is entirely about that. How did the ancient world see people not as equals, but as there being a hierarchy? And that gets right to the heart of the ancient order and how it works. So thank you for raising that point.
Yeah,
Sharon,
I'll just say that this is a point observing in history. Their attitude was only the most competent and established people were at the top. And historically, unless you did well, like an English landowner, if he got himself into debt, he lost his land. Somebody more competent took his place.
mm-hmm. Sharon, then Phil. Go ahead, Sharon.
I just want to expand on something of what Stephen just said, because this was something that I was thinking about. As aristocracy expanded, it created modernity. Because as I said before, when you had the churches with stained glass windows, because people weren't literal, they couldn't read, they didn't have an education, they died early, society was easy to manage. As we got advanced, and the questions that faced the aristocrats started facing the people who were once serfs, then we went into modernity. I think that's what Stephen is saying. Mm-hmm. And that's the impression that I get. The second point I want to make is the point that Phil was discussing about the changing of perspective. To change your perspective, you have to be rational. And in his book, Steven Pinker talked about a theorem that I forgot about, Bayes' theorem, where it says the law of probability governing the strength of the evidence. whether or not you're going to change your mind when new evidence comes along. If you can, then that makes it rational. If you can adopt a new perspective, that makes it rational. And I think there's a question of whether or not we as moderns are rational people, as Kant said we were going to be, as Kant said we should.
Right. Yeah. Preparation for dealing with the empirical mismatch between human confidence in what we think we know and what the world has to say about it, what nature has to say about it, the basis of science. It's one of those fundamental things that it's sort of shocking that we let anybody get out of childhood without having really delved into this problem, because it's one of the most central problems of the human condition, that so much of we know just isn't so. And it's one of the advantages of the old craft system. When people would work their way up, apprentice, journey, or master, they would get the opportunity to work with people all their lives who knew more than they did. I think, and you see this in medicine. Medicine has preserved the craft system for this reason. It's incredibly valuable to be constantly reminded that we're not the top of the pyramid when it comes to knowledge, that there are people with more experience and more understanding, and that we shouldn't feel defensive about that or angry about that. We should feel happy about that, because it means we have things to learn, we have room to grow, right? And especially if it's put together into a system of nurturing, like is done in the best medical schools, where you get to learn from the people's lifetime of experience as you're coming up when you're fresh. When I was a kid, my first exposure to this was in traditional Okinawan martial arts, which is run off a similar system. You know, you come in and nobody pretends that you're Bruce Lee. You're a kid, and you're at the beginning of a long ladder of learning, and you learn to respect the people who know more than you do, without worshiping. You don't have to worship them abjectly like gods, but you learn to respect a lifetime of experience and what it's taught people, a lifetime of kind of hands-on, interaction with reality that has helped them to overcome their own illusions that we ourselves haven't yet begun to overcome when we first start out. That idea that everybody, even the best black belt, even the masters of the craft, have more to learn, and they'll tell you that. They'll tell you, that a potter at the end of his life will tell you, studying pottery taught me so much, and I'm so sorry to be dying because there's so much more to learn. And I'm sorry I could only pass on so much to my students because I only ever learned so much. It helps to create a healthy epistemology in the brain to have that experience of being placed into a proper context in relationship to the cosmos. And I think it's just dangerous that we don't give that experience to most children, that they never really get the chance to find out how to tell the difference between what they think they know and what's out there, that they don't get to spend time in the company of people who are very, very good at something and know so much more than they do, but are willing to help train them and bring them up so that they can see how big the difference is. It's one of the things I loved about medicine when I was working in hospitals, is that they have to preserve that, because the subject matter is too complex to pass on any other way. It's got to be the crafts model. And in the VA, at least during our golden age, we were able to develop medical software the same way, because it was largely medical personnel doing the software development. They naturally brought the same teaching model over. You were constantly training up apprentices and doing hands-on work and doing the empirical investigation. It shows, well, go ahead and try it and see what happens. See, it crashed for the bug. Why did it crash for the bug? Well, blah, 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 blah. Just like you do with medicine. Why didn't this treatment work? Well, because of the following. That back and forth. Modernity wants to take credit for that and say that that's the kind of society we are. But we didn't invent science. It predated us. And we've carefully not allowed science access to most of the worst things about modernity, where it could really clean things up, maybe. So it gets us back to that question of what does it mean to be modern? If on the one hand, we all believe one thing, but on the other, we all do something else. And it creates confusion. Sharon and then Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, can I just to briefly add, that concept you're talking about is, we call it see one, do one, teach one. And
Yes.
it doesn't necessarily mean one. It just means see it, do it, teach it. That's your obligation. And that's the way the system is set up.
Yes.
And I want to say what that does for you as a human being, it gives you a kind of risk literacy, which I think us moderns are missing.
We are.
And so we build these major buildings and we take shortcuts, but we do not look at the risk. And that is also a part of rationality. And I think that's part of that's lacking in our modern behavior.
Yeah, this is where if we apply Hegel and Smith, what they would say is it's, ow, sorry, my cat's clawing my leg. It's precisely not rationality. Noesis and gnosis are two different faculties of the mind. And what science at its best is doing is harnessing gnosis. It's saying, let us experience the world. Let's let the experience of the world argue with our ideas about the world, right? We can have a model and that's nice, but let's put it into the crucible and see what the world does to it and see if it holds up under pressure. And that when we do that, we're going beyond reason. We're that empiricism brings something that reason lacks. Reason lacks the context of what the real world would have to say about things, what Mother Nature would have to say. I know this terminology is contra-modern. It's not modern to use the word reason this way, but what it does is it acknowledges the flaws in the ancient Greek philosophers who thought that they could reason their way to the truth. And yet enormous parts of what they said were provably false. And it recognizes the contribution of the Arabic and Persian philosophers who put those old masters to the test experimentally and began the process of winnowing out rational but false things from things that empirically could stand up to the pressure. And it sort of points the way to the future, that what we want is to take all the parts of our society that we don't allow to be questioned because there's conflicts of interest, there's perverse incentives involved, and give the world a chance to teach us what might be wrong about them. Let some fresh air into old dogmatic hierarchies. And doing that requires going beyond what we've been taught and how we think, to allowing the world to teach us, even if it doesn't seem rational, to do the empirical thing, not just the rational thing. Rational empiricism, bringing together gnosis and noesis, it's not Vernunft, but it kind of, like the finger pointing at the moon, it sort of points in the direction of Hegel's Vernunft. It's some kind of rich intersection between the two where we can find wisdom. Phil, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, I wonder whether that isn't that modern society has gotten so complex and extended that we're really having both problems in the theoretical, I mean, in terms of ideas, the a priori understanding, and also in terms of the experience. Because if that's true, then the Kantian model doesn't work, because the problem is our experience of the complexity of that. We can no longer depend on our sense experience anymore. The instrumentation has replaced that, and we therefore now have to trust the instruments. For instance, LiDAR, which just not so long ago measured the gravitational wave, right?
Yeah.
I did not experience the gravitational wave, right? To say that therefore that counts as the synthetic a priori, I'm not so sure if I would count that, because that's so extended on its derivatives produced by instruments that I'm not sure about that even, let alone the other. And the problem with the logic is that it still have to be proven with the with in a sense, mathematics. Mathematics. It's not that I don't believe in mathematics. I actually believe in mathematics. I think we depend on mathematics, but it certainly has been a dominant part of Western intellectual history, right? Because the proof is in what it is. It's interesting that Henry Poincaré, a 19th century and early 20th century mathematician, says, the whole of mathematics is one tautology. You might as well substitute the word tautology into a Ponzi scheme. Like it all is dependent on itself, right? So if the Ponzi scheme should fall apart, in other words, it's just sort of self-reinforcing, improving, and every time you have a problem, you just invent a little tweak, and now you could see the gravitons. And it's like, it just seems to me like maybe the human being is not capable of that degree of complexity, because the derivatives have gone so far that that maybe we are in some ways reduced to being just a very smart animal, because I think that's how the animals exist in the world. They don't quite know what the thing it is. They kind of bump into things and say, oh, like this seems to work, and we have extended this understanding into a complex world that now we're bumping into this, and you wonder like what's going on, as I wonder about the market is so extended that you don't wonder, and you can't, and then a mathematic comes and say, well, it's going to revert back to its trend or its mean. It's like, I have no idea, and how, and you wonder whether the people who are following the exponential rise are fools, or whether you're a fool because you don't quite understand or believe in the displacement. So I just think that's part of it. The other thing I want to raise up is, about what Steve said, and I actually kind of believe part of what Steve said, but in some sense, it's a little bit different. I mean, let's assume that the people on top is not perverse. They're trying to do the best. This is a big assumption, by the way. I actually don't believe that, but let's assume that's the case. I just wonder whether we have put so much value on efficiency that we have turned the system into a system that's all demanding, and that the people involved and everything else involved are just cogs in the wheel to make the system work. This is not necessarily evil in the sense of exploitation of the, like you said, the wallet, but it's just that the system.
Wallet biopsy.
Yeah, wallet biopsy. Okay, I actually believe about the wallet biopsy, but nonetheless, let's put that aside and just assume that these are all good people that do it the best. But the system has reduced us to being just a singular ant, because the colony is more important than the ant. And I see that, if an ant should be dead, the other ants will be marching along and just push it aside. Like, what's the big deal? Like, we're just part of the machinery that makes the colony survive. Now, I don't know. Maybe that's a better system, because the ants, the ant colony almost seems like a living organism to me. So I'm not sure how to believe whether the individual should be a category or whether the city should be a category. But I'm just part of the clog to make the city operate. And, and I am a replaceable, interchangeable part replacement for the operation of the city. So once you see it that way, you sort of have a kind of more humble view of who the hell you are. You're just like a nut to fit into a bolt. And when you die, you're indifferent they're just going to find another nut to operate the efficient system, right? Until, of course, the system breaks down, like some container ship blocking the Suez Canal, right? That's what you're concerned with, not you as an individual. So I just sort of wonder, like, those things, there's so many things to worry about. Maybe I should just be more simple-minded and just live my life rather than worry about everything that's falling apart that is beyond my understanding.
Yeah, there's an interesting phenomenon. Noesis, when we try to systematize our relations with each other and abstract them, we try to turn people into resources and try to make them interchangeable, we basically lie to ourselves. I've worked with, personally, directly, I've worked with something like 1,000 programmers over my career so far, because the Department of Veterans Affairs, Indian Health Service, the Department of Defense, the nation of Jordan, all kinds of people were using the same software. And it was a total community of about 1,000 programmers, about 10,000 expert users who kind of straddled the line between programmers and users. And in all that time, I never met even 2 programmers who were interchangeable. Not once. Now, most people don't ever get to know that many people personally. I'm talking about people whose names I have the Rolodex, we've solved problems together and so forth, over 40 years. Most people never get the chance to meet that many other people and work directly with them in their careers, enough to form an opinion about their capabilities. But what I see is that people, well, for one thing, the intergenerational transmission of knowledge and wisdom is so shaky. We lose an enormous amount every time somebody dies. Just a staggering, incalculable amount of expertise is lost. We just lost Henry Heffernan, who was a Jesuit priest who helped to lead the underground, what we called the Second Underground Railroad, where the VA was disobeying central office, and they were secretly computerizing against the rules. And they were computerizing in a way that made it so that nurses and doctors and pharmacists and lab techs could write their own software. And they didn't have to just dole out money to the Beltway and hope that they got something good back. And during the late 70s and early 80s, this was a major issue. I mean, people were fired, equipment was confiscated and burned. One group tried to burn down a hospital that had been a center of the underground. It was a big deal, and Henry led all that, and he just died. And he knew how it all came to pass because he
I was wondering,
there.
is there a link for that to explore that issue? There isn't.
I need to write a book. I need to write a book.
Is there any link for the guy that just died?
I haven't seen an obituary yet. Maybe in the next day or two.
So there's nothing about him out in the open.
Not much. He liked to be an insider. He liked to be behind the scenes.
Did you just say that you worked with these people for 40 years?
I've been working in this community for coming on 40 years now. So
you started working with these people when you were 10 years old?
I was 17. I was 17.
Goodness gracious. Wow.
Oh, see, math is a very tricky subject.
What's that?
Math is a very tricky subject, particularly applied to people's ages. The numbers don't always add up exactly like you would think.
Yeah.
No, I mean, doesn't Rick he can't possibly be more than, okay.
I'm in my 50s.
Well said, Donald, well said.
I'm in my 50s. It was June of 84. So, but the point is...
Could we have Henry's name? The guy that'd be...
Yeah, the guy who just
passed,
that. Father Henry Heffernan.
He just died.
He just died, just this week.
Yes.
It was a bit of a blow.
New York Times. They had an obituary in the New York Times for him.
Yeah, and they don't know half of why it's the loss that it is, but literally there are whole swaths of history about how this medical software got put together, how people were able to organize effectively in a way that could mimic the organizational structure of medicine and mimic it in medical informatics to ensure that medical software was also serving patients and not just serving the beltway and, you know, profits. It was an amazing amount of information he had that he took with him when he died. Nobody is ever going to have that information again. He's the only one who knew a lot of it. The other people who knew have already died. And a lot of it hasn't been written down. So generationally, what's happening now, there is no interchangeable part to move in to play the role that Henry played. That's never going to happen. And it's not just Henry. All of the programmers that I knew from the Underground Railroad and the VA, each of them was so different from the others. They knew different things. They were good at different things, but also they had different personalities. They solved problems in different ways. They related to other human beings in different ways. You couldn't drop anybody else just into those positions because they wouldn't have those relationships. They wouldn't know how to use the network of experts, you know, to help each other the way that that person did. It would have to, you basically, when someone dies, you don't replace somebody else into the same role. You permanently lose that role. And you have to invent a new one that's suitable for whoever you can find to try to do that sort of work. And it's going to be different. So there's this way in which, from a noetic perspective, we tend to quantify people and talk about, you know, interchangeable parts. But when you look at the actual meaningful, measurable impact of the dynamics of the way people think and reason and relate to each other, what their interests are, you discover that you just can't add and subtract people that way. It literally changes society when somebody dies.
Mm-hmm.
And it changes society, not in some subtle, touchy-feely way. I mean, it measurably impacts the outcomes of things that other people just simply don't know how to do what that person did. You know, when we talk about the complexities of society, one of the things that we miss out on sometimes is the enormous amount of human creativity that goes into figuring out how to be effective in the world with a society this complex. And because of the complexity, there's an enormous variety of different ways people could try to tackle these problems. And they because it's at sort of at the levels of complexity or at the limits of what human beings can keep in their head at one time, you can't just teach people to do that and stamp out people, you know, capable of doing it. Instead, each new generation has to creatively engage with this thing and figure out, how do I create a role in which I can be effective and help the world? And when they do that, it is an expression of who they are, their inner nature. This is, you see in this article, he's talking about the way that one of the things that moderns are blind to is the idea that things have an essence, that they have a character, that they have core principles that shape every decision they ever make about who they call on the phone versus who they text message, whether they remember something versus whether they forget it. All these many, many details that go into building a career, they are as personal and creative in some ways as a painting. When you look at a life's work as a whole and what that person, how they wove themselves into the bigger picture and changed the bigger picture by doing it. This is something that some societies have been better at than others in understanding it and in trying to formulate forms of economy and politics and other kinds of governance that take that into account and recognize it and cultivate it, you know, nurture it. We're not very good at that. We don't really believe in essential things or character. We sort of believe, as he says here, in sort of a mechanistic worldview, an extrinsic worldview, because if we organize society that way, it lends itself to noesis, and we love noesis. And we tell ourselves it's because it produces predictable results, but that's not the real reason. You know, you can try to recreate the exact same organization with the same roles defined the same way with the next generation, trying to slot different people into those roles, and they'll fail because those roles weren't designed for them, and that's not how they interact with the world. All the noetic recipe could be perfect, but because you're trying to hammer people into these abstract positions, it doesn't work. It only works when people. What
paragraph are you?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
What paragraph? What paragraph, Rick? I'm trying to follow it in the text.
Yes. So in the text, God, he talks about it all the way through. But when he says moderns lack philosophical acuity, lack intuitive and incisive essentiality, which I'm sure sounds like sort of an arm wavy term, but he doesn't mean that at all. He means the idea that things are not empty mechanisms to be manipulated according to our will, that things are more like organisms that have their own character and laws of growth and development. And if you work with those laws of growth and development, you get great results. But if you ignore them or try to suppress them and force the thing to fit the mold of your abstract ideas, then you're going to fail a lot. This is the critique of modernism versus the ancient physiocratic perspective on the world. And so when he says just a sentence later, moderns cannot see in an essential way, he doesn't mean that they essentially don't see. He means that they don't believe that things have an essence. And therefore, when they look at things, they don't look for the essence. They don't look to say, what is the inner character of this that limits how I can interact with it? They instead focus on what are my plans for it and how can I compel it to do what I want. We have this sort of external way. And so my favorite phrase in this is when he says, we cannot grasp the simple and fatal defining nature of things. Fatal defining nature, right? This is Heraclitus again, that we fail to pay attention to the nature that is around us, but also the nature that is inside of us. The nature inside of us is what he's talking about here, our essence, our character, our laws of growth and development that each of us has that are different from the other people around us, that make us who we are and what we are. And when Heraclitus says character is fate, or when we translate it that way, right? This is the fatal that he means. When he says fatal defining nature, he doesn't just mean deadly. He means the nature that's going to define the entire course of the story, like for Oedipus, because their inner character is going to express itself and shape the story. And we just don't think about the world that way, right? We set goals, we set policies and processes, we set rules, we set metrics. All of this is noetic, and it's all imposed from without. And none of it begins with, why don't we spend some time together so I can start to learn what you're like as a person, and then let's rework the organization. Not just you, not just how can we force you to meet our goals, but how can we rework the organization so that it's an organization that can be better having you in it than not having you in it, based on who you are as a person and what kinds of things you can and can't do. You know what I mean? When we hire people, we expect them to comply, like the Borg or like Hydra. We don't say, okay, now that you're the person doing this, I see that you're really more creative. You'd like to do more art than the previous guy. So maybe we should shift our strategy to involve more graphic design. We don't like change the whole company strategy based on who's in the company. But if we were ancients, we would.
Yes.
Because the combination of people is not a mechanism, it's an organism from the ancient worldview. And so it can only make sense if all of the organs are working together in harmony based on their own natures. Stephen and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, what Phil was referring to, and this seems to have been completely forgotten by most of the conversation I hear today, that in earlier societies were religious, for example, we had the Christian religious society, and it always faced the question that man is a creature lower than the angels and higher than the animals. But the Christian society, or any religious society, had a bias that human beings were fallen angels, that there was something good in man that could rise up. Now, we've come into a world which the behaviourists have come along and said, hey guys, do you see just how much you like chimpanzees? And they're probably right. And people, just contemporary people recently have forgotten this. They seem to be sleepwalking around. Yes, at the end of the day, we're all angels and we'll all be good. I was trying to explain this to somebody. They're doing a piece of fiction, and I had talking about a Roman slave and the fictional life of a Roman slave and how their master treated them. And I was pointing out to her that you've got this master treating this slave as if that they were their own child. And this very, very, very rarely happened in ancient society, that a master, if we have the chance to slap around another human being, we're eventually going to end up there. The only reason we don't is there are consequences. For example, an ancient very rarely viewed a slave fondly. It could happen. But generally, a master looked upon his slave as property, and a clever master didn't damage his property. A stupid master would kill his slave out of a fit of anger. The only thing that stops people is consequences, and harming a slave generally didn't have very great consequences, except to the master themselves. But watch out for this attitude that up there's a hierarchy that is looking at your benefit. The hierarchy up above you is eventually going to trend to viewing its subjects as slaves and slapping them around. But don't forget that ancient concept of angel versus animal. Just how much are we animals?
Mm-hmm.
Don't put such faith in the idea that there will be always a hierarchy above you that will behave as though you're all angels to be treated as angels. I don't think I've framed that very well, but that's the question. Are we angel or animal?
Well, I think I know what you're getting at. And there's a number of ways to tackle this. It's going to come up a lot over the course of this book as we go through this question of, how do we organize human societies and what are our expectations and are they realistic? So modernism argues that people are pretty much the same. We're all created equal. And that it inherits that from the idea of what was the heretical idea during the medieval era of the brotherhood and sisterhood of man, that we're all peers. And that therefore, nobody has any more right to rule than anybody else. Nobody's really better than anybody else. We all have equal chances. And we should organize our politics and economy accordingly. But the Greeks said, but anybody can see that's not true. I mean, Jeffrey Dahmer and Martin Luther King are not equals, right? I mean, one person was repeating Jesus's message saying we should love one another and we should be willing to sacrifice ourselves for the greater good. And the other person was seriously messed up and eating people. And to treat these people as identical, as equal, is to ignore the obvious evidence in front of our eyes of gnosis in favor of the programming we've received in terms of noesis, that we're supposed to pretend everybody's the same. And our response to situations like that is to say, well, okay, maybe people aren't identical, but the system should be identical and it shouldn't make any assumptions. But we use that as cover to say the system shouldn't learn from experience. The system should always churn out the same mechanical rules regardless of what's actually physically happening in the world. There is this collision, if you will, in modernism between the expectations we've been trained with about the equality we're all supposed to have and what actually happens in the world. So when con artists get in charge of things and screw over people for a quick buck, or whatever the reason, whatever their motivation, we really have trouble dealing with that appropriately. If you look, for example, in the United States at the requirements to become president, you have to be of a certain age and you have to be a US citizen. And well, let's look at the rest of the list. Do you have to show any particular wisdom?
No.
Do you have to
Ooh,
have shown
absolutely not.
any successful experience in governing anything anywhere?
Wow,
think-
boy.
This
Yeah.
is one of the most powerful countries in the earth. It is a nuclear power, and there's no requirement that the president have ever governed anything successfully. And I'm not talking about any particular political party here. I'm not talking about any particular individuals from history. I'm just saying, as a system, you can see baked into it the assertion that we're all equals. And so it doesn't matter which one, we're all interchangeable. It doesn't matter who becomes president. If everybody wants somebody to become president, well, then that's who it should be. The people have spoken.
And that's what happened.
And so it's confusing, right, when you try to understand this. So there is on the one hand, we've got that problem. But on the other hand, what Kenneth Smith and Hegel and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Hannah Arendt and others say is that, in fact, it's obvious not only that people aren't equal, but that they're also not infinitely diverse, that we drop into biological castes based on our preferences for how we live our lives and how we make our decisions. And some people really need guidance longer than other people need guidance because they're so driven by their appetites.
Okay, you're dealing with the equality, but with the condition, are modern human beings or human beings of any era really little more than sophisticated animals, sophisticated chimpanzees?
Well, this is something we have to explore over time. It's more complicated than that, right? Because chimpanzees aren't primitive versions of humans.
No.
We're not just like more sophisticated chimpanzees. We both evolved from the point at which we diverged, and they've gone.
I see Sharon has got such enormous faith of in the reasonableness and goodness of human nature.
Yes, I do.
She studied in her church well. I, of course, have listened to Nietzsche's Master Morality.
Yeah, but the point I'm trying to make here is actually agreeing with you from a different angle, Stephen. And it goes like this. If these existentialist philosophers are right, some people are born really wanting guidance. Whether that's something they can grow out of or not, I don't think any of us knows. But some people, when you look at the Darwin Award winners, when you look at the way some people just ruin their lives by chasing quick rewards, some people really just need more help than they're getting in growing up. They're just not getting enough. And for people like that to have masters who prey upon them is as awful as for a child to be born into a family that abuses the child. When someone has a biological driving need for nurturing, but what they get instead is a hierarchy that preys upon them, what we've created is a cruel and unusual situation, right? It's morally repugnant. And it happens. We can see it happen all the time in the world around us. And you're right. You can look at examples from ancient Rome. You can look at examples from medieval. There's countless examples throughout history of places where people needed help and what they got was predation instead of help. So if we're thinking about axiology and the basis for an ethical society, this is one of the fundamental problems. You've got to be able to figure out who needs the help and get it to them, right? Whether it's that they're mentally ill, whether it's that, they have a broken leg, whatever the problem is.
Oh, sorry, Rick, why should we be good and interested in the welfare of others?
That's a longer discussion.
If you've got a God up there who's, and then I realise it's in my own best interest to be moral, otherwise I'm going to hell. You've got a good argument. This is the beauty of it. The Christians, who the atheists despise, do, at the end of the day, it might look simple, but they've got a pretty good argument. There's this all-powerful being above you, and if you're a bad boy, you're going to hell. Beautiful. You've got a real argument. Self-interest says, I must be good. But once you've sliced that out of the picture, thrown that God away, as Nietzsche's madman said, why?
We're going to explore this very question in great detail over the course of this book. We're going to look at it from the ancient perspective, from the medieval perspective, and from the modern perspective. I promise you, Stephen, we will not do short shrift on this. You are putting your finger right on one of the core issues. We just can't do it today because we're running out of time and we've got to get through this chapter. This chapter doesn't really dig into it. This isn't the place that really explores and opens up the issues at the level to do justice to what you're asking. This is just talking about where are modern's blind spots that make us unlikely to be receptive to the premise of a book like this. Why, if we don't believe that there's anything missing from our worldview, if we think we're seeing everything objectively pretty much the way it is, then what interest do we have in understanding the medieval worldview or the ancient worldview? Because ipso facto, they must be inferior to ours if you accept the modernist dogma. So this opening chapter is where he's just basically addressing that. And he's trying to say, well, what's missing? What is it that moderns don't have? What is the thing that our frame excludes that makes it hard for us to understand not just ancient epochs, but even to understand ourselves or our world? In fact, that's the end of the sentence that I cited. We cannot grasp the simple and fatal defining nature of things, our own selves and culture most of all. That is, we don't know ourselves. We have illusions about ourselves. And it's why the more we embrace the Star Trek picture of ourselves as a great march of progress into the stars and towards, utopia, the more we're unable to explain why we can't get clean water to Flint, Michigan, right? It's an example of what Kenneth Smith calls a surd, S-U-R-D, a surd. A surd is something that within a given worldview is inexpressible. It can't be said, it can't be thought, it can't be possible. We cannot simultaneously be the pinnacle of creation at the height of our godlike powers and yet completely incompetent to handle the most basic things that human beings have been successfully doing for thousands of years. How can we not get clean water to a small town when we've got all this money to spend on so many other things? How are we unable to do that? And if we accept the premise of modernism, there is no answer. It's not.
Is there
possible.
anybody in Flint, Michigan that's worth the trouble?
Oh, could it be selfishness, Rick? I mean, human beings ultimately are selfish. And so once their self-interest is satisfied, because how can we, the reason we don't concern ourselves about clean water to Flint, Michigan, or clean water to all these needed countries in developing world. It's because I think it comes down to selfishness. They create, they advance, whether it be in technology, whatever, to achieve individual needs or their small village community needs, or I say it's more to do with selfishness ultimately.
Sure, but that's your answer. The question is, what is modernity's answer? How does America explain it to itself? In America, the only form of selfishness we really are willing to talk about is enlightened self-interest. Right? That's the basis of capitalism. The basis of capitalism is a Kantian one that says that all human beings are equipped with enlightened self-interest that allows us to understand the world as it actually is, to evaluate our risks and opportunities, and to make a rational choice of the best available to us. That's the basis of capitalism. Right? If that's not true, then capitalism has no moral basis. Likewise, if we look at the basis of democracy as practiced in the United States, the premise is, you see it in jury selection. It's the reasonable man theory, that any reasonable person, provided the basic evidence, would reach the same reasonable conclusion. That's the basis of juries. If that's not true, then then trial by jury doesn't make any sense, the way that we explain it. neither of these things allows for sort of overweening selfishness, self-destructive selfishness. If there is such a thing, and I'm not saying there's not, Jenny, I'm not saying you're not right, but if there is such a thing, it doesn't fit in the framework that we use to explain ourselves with. Our explanation doesn't include that. According to our explanations, if anyone was egregiously selfish, it must involve breaking the law somehow, and then they would get in trouble and we'd arrest them and we'd put them in prison, and then they wouldn't be a hazard anymore. And then we'd be left with people whose selfishness was at a healthy level. That's the theory of the legal system, right? That the outliers will be weeded out and we'll be left with a healthy norm. But again, that still doesn't explain Flint, Michigan. Just like we have an entire country of however many 100 million people we have right now, with all the resources we have, and we can't even manage this basic thing.
So could it be then limited government, limited politicians, their limited mentality?
It's the distribution of public resources that I think in this country is made based on economics and to some extent race. That's why the pandemic scoured the lower socioeconomic level. It has to do again with the distribution and access to healthcare resources. The same reason you can't get water to Flint, Michigan.
But you see how that's a contra-modern position. It might be true, but modernity can't acknowledge that. If it's true that we are that benighted and backwards, then what happens to enlightened self-interest? What's the basis for capitalism? And if that's true, what happens to the reasonable man theory, the basis of that we should allow people to vote? All kinds of things fall apart as far as the framework for why we do what we do as a society, if what you're saying is true. Again, I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just saying there is a real incoherence here.
Yes, there is.
Right at the center where we ought to be understanding ourselves and why we do the things we do, we have all kinds of basic things we can't explain. And instead of it provoking a crisis where we all say, let's all get together and talk it out and figure out what we're going to do about this, our response is to try not to think about it. We go watch a TV show.
The thing is, Rick, if you were the king, all these problems would be resolved. Flint, Michigan issue not be around. There would not be Flint, Michigan issue if you were the king.
I would be a terrible king.
Please.
He would also be dead, Jenny.
Oh yeah. Very
There's no way he would be allowed to rule.
That's true.
This
Yeah, you have a point there, Donald.
Is this going to impact our Monday afternoons?
it would get in the way of our Monday afternoons, and I would never allow that.
Okay, thank you. That's all I needed to hear.
That's right.
So Rick,
this has already been tried. You didn't get the message. Rick's been telling you about this was the attitude in the Middle Ages. Once we have the benevolent dictator above us, God, we'll all come up roses. No, sorry, this has been heavily discussed.
Well, we had 1,000 years to disprove it,
Get
right?
off this wagon, please.
So Rick and Jenny, I think these are concepts, and so long as we continue to struggle towards the concept, then we're living.
Yes.
That's the way I see it.
And we have hope, maybe. There's a little bit of hope. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
And discussions like this, the more, regardless of the answers we come up with or don't come up with, the more we engage with the question, the more we look at that blind spot and insist on starting to learn about it, the more we become healthier.
Yes.
I saw you put a Hedy Lamarr there, Stephen.
Hedley Lamarr was the villain in Blazing Saddles, and my hero.
Oh, that's right.
Harvey Korman.
That's right.
The beauty of him is he had no doubts about his self-interest.
Yes.
He just didn't have an idea that he was doing anything bad. As far as he was concerned, being bad was being good.
Exactly. So I'm going to call on Phil and Donald in a second, but where I want to circle this back around is it's very easy to look at them. Once you know what to look for, it is incredibly easy to look at the modern world and see example after example after example after example of how the thing that we're missing is the most important thing. We've never figured out why we're even here or what we're supposed to be doing. Like, as a society, what's our point? Are we supposed to help people? Are we supposed to win a competition? Are we supposed to progress and become advanced? What is the point? And we don't know. We don't, the medieval epoch may have screwed up in countless ways, but they knew what they were trying to do. They were crystal clear that they wanted to try to create a society ruled by God. And they knew why. Because God, being all-knowing and all-powerful and all good, was uncorruptible. And they hoped that that would be the basis of the first society in the history of the world that wasn't actually corrupt. Anybody could understand that premise. It makes sense. We may not agree with parts of it. We may think that there were flaws in it. We may criticize how spectacularly they failed, as Stephen points out, but we understand what they were trying to do. And you can do the same thing with the ancient epoch. We could talk through, and we will, because after we get through chapters 3 and 4, we're going to turn to the ancients and see what did they think they were doing. But what did the moderns think they're doing? What they think they're doing is not talking about.
They've assassinated God, as Nietzsche was pointing out.
Yes.
And he saw that we're in deep trouble, even if there isn't a God.
Right. We're going to try to solve our problems without nature and without God, but we're not saying what we're adding to the picture to try to make up for it. Why are we here? What are we trying to do? And our answer is, we don't really know. We're really deeply confused right at the heart of things. And Kenneth says, if you're trying to understand what a modern is, this has to be on your list of the top 3 things. To be a modern is to be confused about the very most important things in a way that medievals weren't and ancients weren't. They may have been wrong about all kinds of stuff, but they knew what they were trying to do. We don't know what we're trying to do, which is a very weird thing not to know. Because then how do we know if we succeeded or not? Did we win yet? Who can tell, right? Phil and then Donald. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I still believe in the fallen angels. I've been preoccupied with that for 35 years.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure whether your criticism about modernity holds up unitarily, because in some sense, it has been the problem throughout. I could accept a kind of a hierarchical structure, but the problem is that they're always, in some sense, I don't know whether it's part of human nature or whatever it is, that consolidates into a system of power. That happened in China, certainly, with Confucianism and the emperor. That certainly happened, in Persia. That happened in Rome. So in some sense, I don't know whether human beings could develop a structure that's both a structure yet with enough flux to account for individuality of individuals, that allows individuals that are more pronounced to rise to the top and to, in a sense, support the lesser, if you want to call them the herd, to sustain them. I just do not know, because it almost always, like the Indian culture was very different from ours, but it consolidated essentially into a caste system, right? Which is even worse than what we have. Once you're born into that, you're stuck there forever. And so in some sense, I just wonder, and maybe, I've been listening to a lot of videos by this guy called Yanis Varoufakis. who's been talking about something that's interesting about capitalism. It seems like he still believes in liberalism, the human spirit, I suppose, which is what I sort of still believe in. That unfortunately, modernity is founded in the dual principle of the liberation of the human spirit and the liberation of capital. I think he still believes that there is a possibility for the liberation of human spirit.
Mm-hmm.
But he thinks that capitalism has totally fallen apart. And it's interesting that he calls it, part of that is because the instrumentation of capital, and particularly with the new technologies, which has so much power, that he says what has done is not only transcended liberalism, but transcended the nation state.
Yeah.
And essentially what's happened is that you have this sort of strange, what he calls fiefdom of pockets of technological domination. And that they are in many ways independent and cannot control. And so therefore, in a sense, capitalism, in a way, in some sense, no longer exists, as at least Adam Smith perceives it, as a potential for goodness in a somewhat manageable way. It in fact has become this fiefdom of different pockets of power that essentially is self-contained. So you might go to the store and you go to the electronic store and you have all these products with different brand names, but they are all actually labeled Amazon, 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 Amazon. So that's all there really is. It just has the appearance of diversity, but in fact, it's one thing. So I think, I think he's worth listening to. And I'm thinking in particular, the thing, why I believe in the liberation of human ideas. I remember when I was teaching in Ohio, there was a university. I might be Findlay University, but I don't want to quote it directly because I might be mistaken. But it was in Ohio that believe in a system in which you have a manager of any particular department and you hire temporary people, right? And that is, in a sense, a university of interchangeable parts. Now, why we believe that, why I do not believe in that university, because I believe an individual bring the diverse talent into something else. It is quite obvious that many universities actually believe in that model more than my model of the diversity of individual could bring creativity to a force. Because what happened is, let's say you have an English department, you have very wonderful teachers, could teach you many ideas. They also have an English department. They have the same curriculum, right? Have art departments. They also have an art department. At the end, you offer a degree. They offer a degree. I suppose when you go out there, if somebody is very perceptive and say, oh, this thing is from Finlay is worthless, right? But the fact of the matter is that the diploma becomes an equalizing factor, at least for an average situation. So therefore, when you're a student particularly, you're just a dumbass coming out of high school. You don't know. You go to class, you took English 1, A, 1B, intermediate English, whatever it is, advanced literature, you got the same thing. The other guy got the same thing, or equal, but obviously not. How do you overcome a situation in which there is that sense of equality, at least on a very basic level, from one university to another university. That's the thing that, you know, you're fighting against. And when I fight against it, in a way, it's kind of like, well, you know, like you might think you're special, but you could be replaced. And that's happened over and over again, right? You're going to be replaced because there's another guy. You see all those guys waiting on. I used to tell my students, you know, let's say you're very, very special. You're 1 in a million. A job open up and you think, oh, well, don't worry, I'll go there and I'll get it. And so you're lounging around, then later you drop in and the guy says, stand in line. You know, I said, imagine you're in China. The guy said, oh, wait in line. It's a very long line. And you say, well, but you might not understand. I'm 1 in a million. Right? You obviously want to talk to me. I'm 1 in a million, very special, don't you see? He says, yes. We go stand on the other line. Like, and the other line is like, oh, that's 1,500 people there. You sure that's the line? So, well, no, yeah, they're all 1 in a million.
Yeah,
Go stand in that line. Go stand in that line. It says, well, maybe I should stay in this line. It's how many people are here? 1.5 billion. You're wondering, like, you have a misunderstanding. You think you're pretty special, but in fact, you are an interchangeable part. If you lived in China, there's a short line of only 1,500 people. Or is it 15,000? I figure what my thing is. It's like, okay, you want to stand in the long line. It's like you have a complexity in a society that, in a sense, have to how should I say, function in an efficient way. You know, just wait in the long line. You know, we don't care about your individuality. That's a conflict you have to deal with.
Yes.
When you're saying you're an individual, we should all respect your other company. No. They can't spend the time interviewing 15,000 people or whatever it is. Very special people, by the way.
Yes.
And change the whole system, you know. In that sense, like, you know, like, well, you're just in a system in which, well, I guess having a fiefdom actually does work better. So, you know, because
smaller cells of organization where you can actually get to know each other, where you can make a difference at a human scale.
Yeah. So I'm just pointing out the contradiction between, like, a theory and the fact that, you know, it had to manifest in practice, and in practice it might be much more difficult.
That's right.
To do that.
Thank you, Phil. Donald and then Sharon. Go ahead, Donald.
Well, I think you've been trying to point out to us, you know, we have the Delphic admonition, know thyself. Modernity responds, there's nothing to know.
Right.
Man has no essence.
We could do anything. We could be anything.
That's right. We stare into the abyss and it just stares back. But
you're too kind to think. You're too kind to think that the abyss actually stares back.
Yeah, it has better things to do, Phil. I'm pretty sure. But there's a strong relationship, at least in antiquity, between knowing thyself and justice, because justice requires knowing the essence of something or of someone in order to know how to treat it justly, you know. So a lot of what we've been talking about, with no self to know, we lose one of the rudders that to guide our actions. it's also, I think, one of the things, it gets to the point you've been making about if you're in an heuristic culture, your laws can say to treat someone justly, and it may be to treat each one differently in accordance with the differences in their own nature.
Yes.
But modernity is left with, well, screw it. Nobody's got a nature. We're all whatever, created from nothing. So we'll just treat everybody the same. We get into processes or procedurals, not judgments. Well, let's run them through the legal system, apply the legal procedures, and we get something that moderns would consider justice, but both medievals and ancients would consider foolishness. You've done nothing. It's quite. Kenneth has got his finger right on this, and it was right at the end of the modern introduction that he took this topic up, that there's nothing to know. I always also think in this topic that, Socrates was famous for being the gadfly, but in his apology, he doesn't say the unexamining life is not worth living. He says the unexamined life. And to examine yourself, you need others. You need your delusions challenged by others. You need this sort of society of kind of philosophical people that are willing to strip you of the illusions you have of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not just for your own benefit. That's so that you can act, because it's only after you've known yourself that you develop any, empathy for the nature of other people, and how then you should treat them justly, or you can just do evil to your enemies and good to your friends, or come up with some simple little, saying to guide you in these things, to keep you from having to do so much work as a modern. That is, because you can't treat people justly unless you know who they are.
Right.
Know their nature and the variations in their nature.
Right.
So our modernity's ignorance is right in the center point where ethics begins, where we judge right action. So it's not unusual that we miss it. It's kind of by design.
Yeah, it's right at the core. Our solution to ending the religious wars is we're just not going to talk about it anymore, right? We're just going to make governments and, economies in which we try not to think too hard about it and try not to argue about it, and hopefully it'll all work out. And that's it. That's what we've got. There's this expression in the computer world, garbage in, garbage out.
Mm-hmm.
So if you provide bad data, it doesn't matter how good your software is, you're still going to get bad results, even if it's formatted all pretty and looks persuasive. But there's a saying that's missing in the computer world, which is, what if you put a diversity of precious things in, but the software fails to make the necessary distinctions between them and treats them all identically? Then you also get garbage out, right? So think about software that's processing the image of a radiological scan of your lungs, and it's looking for, nodules the size of a grain of rice. And if it can find them, and if they have the right characteristics, and if they've grown since the last time it took the image, that might be cancer. Maybe we should intervene and treat it. But if the software fails to make the necessary distinctions between what it sees in the image, then it isn't a lung cancer screening package, no matter what it calls itself, and no matter how it formats its results. You can give it all the good data in the world, but its failure to attend to the essential distinctions in things causes it to be incompetent. And this is the existentialist critique of modernism, that we get so many details right, but we never attend to the essential nature of things. And so we treat con artists like they're honest, and we treat honest people like they're criminals, because we insist everybody has to be treated the same. And we end up creating a society in which it drives honest people berserk, trying to deal with the stupidity of it, all the rote things that have to be done, all of the stupid deadlines and so forth. But a society that con artists learn how to manipulate, because since it has no discriminating judgment, it lends itself to predatory personalities to get in control of the machinery. After all, it doesn't care who's running the machinery, right? Because it doesn't pay attention to character. Character's irrelevant. But there's this thing Martin Luther King Jr. said. He talked about, he dreamed about the day when his boys would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of
their character. Yes.
And I'm struck by how profound that part of his statement is. And it's the part that so many people skip over. They say, oh, he was just against racism. It's like, he was against racism, but he was for so much more than that. He was also for, we should be judged by the content of our character. We should pay attention to the distinctions between people of good character and people of bad character. And we should create a world in which people of good character can do good things for people. And they're not constantly thwarted by people of bad character. And to pretend that there's no difference between the two, was something that he faced over and over and over in his, I love his letter from the Birmingham jail.
Yeah, yes.
Where he talks about all the people who called themselves allies, but they didn't behave like allies. They didn't have the essential character of allies. They just branded themselves that way. And he's like, see, you get this sort of empty formalisms when you try to build a system that ignores the essential character of things.
Well, you can get social credit on your phone app in China, that signifies that you're a person of good character.
I've seen that.
I think that's what modernity does to these kinds of, oh, yes, we need to make this distinction. So let's mindlessly make this distinction.
Quantize
it's a citizen
it.
score. It's a citizen score.
Citizen score.
That's it. Yeah.
Let's go ahead.
Yeah, it's a social credit system based on your citizen score.
Yes.
So yeah. So, and here's where you get into the idea that you can count everything, and it's just that everything can be reduced to a number, and we've talked about this idea of like the greatest number for the greatest good. It's like everything can be reduced to this quantifiable spreadsheet. Now, even your citizen, how good of a citizen you are. I'm a citizen of China, therefore, and my score is this to prove it. Exactly. It's actually, God,
may I
it's not even like
this is my question. This is the process. This is where rationalism is going.
Isn't it also like your rating based on your YouTube following, for example?
Yes.
Isn't it the same kind of thing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
we have a different model for it. The United States just has a different model, like for doing it. They're private enterprises. Yeah, like they have. Yeah, exactly. We have our own credit scoring system, and I mean, it's now you just add some social aspect to it as well. So it's actually terrifying.
It is.
Really is.
I want to say one thing to Phil. When you were talking before, I misheard Confucianism as Confucianism. And I thought that's so characterized, that one word change brought it right into modern society.
Yeah.
So can we just say how Kenneth Smith sums this up, Rick?
Please, Sharon. Yeah, go ahead.
Because back to the text, because I think it's just very, very good. He says, in our time, the only philosophical significant question can be, has modernity depleted its essential resources of order? Has it spent its sanity and authority? I think that's what we're talking about here.
Yes.
Right? No form of culture. And then he gives a forecast. No form of culture endures by virtue of sheer mechanical deadweight. It is necessary for any civilization as a complex and extended work of man, which we are, to continue to be believed in, which we are not, by man, and thus necessary for it to continue to produce human beings competent to value and believe. And I think that those three sentences just really sum up the dilemma we're facing. He did this very, very well.
Yes. Yes. Considering how loquacious he can be, this chapter 3 is surprisingly short. He really just makes his core argument from beginning to end about what our problem is going to be reading this book. And the one thing he doesn't do is come out and say, so, dear reader, you're going to have a hard time with this book because you're a modern. He critiques the moderns and what's wrong with them at the core. What his reason for putting it here, even though he doesn't come out and say it, is he's telling us we're going to have a problem with this book, because he's basically, the entire thing only makes sense if it's possible that modernity doesn't see everything beautifully and objectively and perfectly. If it's true that we actually need other worldviews to supplement ours, to help us see into our blind spots, only then does this project make sense. And right off the bat, almost no modern is going to agree with that. It's just, why would we want to look at obsolete belief systems, which is what we think everybody else's perspective is? We're the modern one and they're the obsolete ones. And that's why we call ourselves modern. We think we're more advanced. So yeah, thank you for citing that, Sharon. Phil, go ahead. And then we're going to wrap up because I think we actually covered this chapter. We might go on to chapter 4 next week.
Yeah, I want to point out a short thing, and then I want to point out another thing. The short thing is I did say that Henry Poincaré, who's a mathematician, a very respected mathematician, said, that all of mathematics, after all, is just one big tautology. So that should say it all. The other thing I want to say is a quick response to Donald. Actually, in a way, it's not a sarcastic response. I want to deal with Groucho Marx. In Duck Soup, they were looking over a legal document, and so Groucho saw something, and he's running around telling everybody, but you don't understand, what about the sanity clause? So he's running around to everybody saying, what about the sanity clause? And then finally, after running around, he finally ran into Chico, who says, come on, you and I both know there's no such thing as a sanity clause. I thought he was basically a Dadaist in the popular media.
I need to rewatch that film. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's been a while. Well,
so next week.
Well, before we say next week, let me take us to the final 2 sentences of this chapter, which are, my argument and explication can be meant only for those who have struggled in some measure to attain a mind of their own. All others read on at peril of their own self-distress and bewilderment. So partially it's because he's going to talk about the character and essence of these different epochs. So unless we can believe in the possibility that things can be organisms that have a character and an essence, none of what follows is going to make any sense. Likewise, we have to believe in the possibility that modernity could be fallible and might not know everything, and that we might have something to learn. Otherwise, we're going to find it annoying. In two things about this. One is, in a traditional Okinawan martial arts dojo, the sensei isn't just telling you what to do and he's also watching what you do. He's having you do the kata without him. And he's watching very closely because he can see nuances that you can't see yet because you're not as far along as he is. And then he gives each person different feedback depending on what their own strengths and weaknesses are to help them see, you know, what have you achieved recently? What have you learned that you want to hang on to because that was great progress? And then what's maybe the next thing you could be working on? This idea of a constant cycle of helpful healing criticism designed to help you grow is something I took for granted because I was doing this from age 6 to age 13. I didn't know most people didn't get that until later in life, I found out. If you don't ever grow up in that kind of a environment, it can be really hard to hear criticism. It can feel like an attack. It can feel like it's mean-spirited and meant to be destructive. And certainly the concept of judgment, when we look at the medieval framework, is that God judges you to decide whether you're going to go to eternal reward or eternal punishment. And so people get squirrely around being judged. We sort of inherit this fear that the judgment must be meant towards damnation or destruction. So, you know, it's understandable that having somebody go at modernity the way that he does, it can be really uncomfortable. We don't really have the framework for that. But these last two sentences, you know, one of the things that I like to be able to do for this group is show you when he's making a reference, even if he doesn't cite his reference. This is a Nietzsche quote that he's citing here, but he's not quoting him. He's just rephrasing him. And the Nietzsche quote is this: philosophy was only ever meant for the healthy. The sick it has ever made sicker. And this is his way of talking about the Procrustean bed of the mind. That even a completely unphilosophical person has a mind sophisticated enough to reinterpret anything philosophical they're exposed to make it say what they want it to say instead of what it actually says. And as a result, it can be destructive, right, to engage in it. I always think of the film A Fish Called Wanda, where Kevin Costner's character believes he's a Nietzschean, but he doesn't actually understand Nietzsche. And he thinks Nietzsche's saying all kinds of things that Nietzsche's absolutely not saying. And there is this great moment late in the film when Jamie Lee Curtis's character finally turns and lets him have it and tells him all the things that he's misunderstood over and over through all the years, including how he's completely misunderstood Nietzsche. And Kevin Costner's acting at that moment. His face is so crestfallen as he's just one illusion after another is torn apart. And he just stands there, you know, in self-distress and bewilderment, just like Kenneth Smith is saying here. I can't help but think of that moment when he says,
I didn't know that film was so deep. Oh my goodness.
Oh,
I
yeah,
have
it's
to watch
fantastic. Yeah, if you haven't seen A Fish Called Wanda, I just adore it. So
okay.
So this is a Nietzscheism, right? Because Nietzsche was not a nihilist. Nietzsche believed in value systems, and he hated nihilism. That was his basis for critiquing modernism. He said it has nihilism at its core. There is an abyss at the core. And he's talking about the same thing we talked about today, that where its heart should be, where it should have values, where it should have vitality and drive and life and be well adapted to the world, it's instead really empty right there. It's really good at all the other stuff, but there's a great big hole in the middle.
I just bring up my parting question. I think, yeah, people need to meditate upon what rationalism is, and we use this word reason, but does anybody actually understand it?
Yeah, I don't think we do.
Okay, there's a question for you, Rick. You can present your bit on it next week. Hopefully we'll be all here, but find out what rationalism is for us.
When I'm done reading this book, I'll let you know, because I'm enjoying it. I'm just through the science of it. And so I'll give you a synopsis of it. It's very, very good. Because he's just now coming into the social science of it, right? He did the logic, the probability, the forecasting, the perceived scientific basis for rationalism and why we're rational and why we change our minds. That's where I was thinking about the Bayesian theory, where you look at a set or look at a probability and change your mind based on new facts. You look at an issue that's probable and you can change your mind based on new facts. Only rational people seem to be able to do that. So as I come into the social side of it, because this guy's a psychologist, I'll talk about it next week. I promise.
Thank you, Sharon.
if that's okay with you, Rick.
But thank you, Rick.
Really, thank you, Rick, and don't forget us when you're king of the world.
Yeah, that's
Never.
right.
Oh God, stop it. I would be the
That's
worst.
right. Yeah.
I would be the worst.
It's been tried. It didn't work.
Right. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
You guys are big teases. All right. Well, have a great week.
So
And we'll
All
pick
right.
up
You too.
chapter
See you
four.
next
on to
week.
chapter
Bye-bye.
4?
Chapter
Rick,
4.
we're in chapter 4 next week. Okay.